And we begin with President Trump back home in New York City for the first time since taking office, as he tries to move past the controversy over his initial response to the deadly Charlottesville attack. Good morning to you. I'm John Scott.
And I'm Heather Childers. Thank you very much for sticking around or joining us. You know, not really a welcome return home for the president, as protesters greeted the president at Trump Tower last night, hours after he spoke out again on the events in Virginia, after widespread criticism that he did not directly condemn white supremacist groups in his initial remarks.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence. It has no place in America. And as I have said many times before, no matter the color of our skin, we all live under the same laws. We all salute the same great flag. And we are all made by the same Almighty God. We must love each other, show affection for each other, and unite together in condemnation of hatred, bigotry, and violence. We must rediscover the bonds of love and loyalty that bring us together as Americans.
We have Team Fox coverage with Doug McKelway live in Charlottesville. First, though, we go to David Lee Miller live in New York City. David Lee.
Good morning, John. It is relatively quiet here at Trump Tower, but as you would expect, there is a great deal of security. The scene here last night, though, was indeed very, very different. There were thousands of protesters out on the street. They were there to criticize President Trump about his remarks concerning recent events in Charlottesville. Mr. Trump, interestingly, entered the building through the back entrance, and he did not see most of the demonstrators. A smaller number of Trump supporters were also on hand. The two sides were peaceful, but there were some verbal barbs that were exchanged. 3 people were arrested, but mostly for things like disorderly conduct. Meanwhile, a total of 3 CEOs have now resigned from the President's Advisory Council on Manufacturing regarding his remarks about Charlottesville. The most recent resignations, the CEO of Intel and the CEO of Under Armour, took place after Mr. Trump's condemnation of the KKK and other white supremacist groups. And on the agenda today at Trump Tower will be infrastructure. Let's take a live look right now at the lobby of Trump Tower. In a very short amount of time, we expect that entering this building will be the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, Elaine Chao, the Transportation Secretary, and other members of the administration. They will be here regarding an executive order that Mr. Trump is expected to sign that will essentially streamline the red tape to get approval for major infrastructure projects. The order is essentially going to set a 2-year goal for completion of the permitting process. Meanwhile, we expect that Mr. Trump is going to spend most of today in Trump Tower. He may, in fact, make an appearance in the lobby of the building. He is going to overnight here, and then tomorrow, John, he is expected to return to Bedminster, New Jersey, where he will return to his country club. We also expect that outside Trump Tower, which again is relatively quiet, the demonstrators will return, many of them still very critical of Mr. Trump's remarks in connection with recent events in Virginia. John?
David Lee Miller outside Trump Tower, where the dump trucks in the background are part of the security, not a construction project.
Yeah.
David, thank you.
Little security line there. Well, 3 days after the chilling violence in Charlottesville, Virginia.
That's when white nationalists organized a rally because they were upset that a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee was going to be taken down. The Charlottesville police chief saying he deeply regrets the loss of life there.
Absolutely, I have regrets.
And what are your regrets?
We lost 3 lives this weekend. I certainly have regrets. We lost 3 lives this weekend, a local citizen and 2 fellow officers. We certainly have regrets. It was a tragic weekend.
Now people in other cities are reacting by taking down many Confederate statues. Doug McKelway live in Charlottesville, Virginia right now. Doug.
Hi, John, and this is the epicenter of the rioting that we saw early Saturday morning. This is Emancipation Park with the statue of Robert E. Lee sitting high atop his horse Traveler here. There is already talk of this monument being brought down not under the auspices of the city, but by vigilantes who want to chain this thing up and yank it down with their vehicles. It's hard to distinguish whether that is real news or just the kind of stuff that we see on the internet that may not happen. There are significant police presence around here, and it would be hard to see how that could possibly happen. But even just this morning, we saw an incident here. A man with a Confederate flag stood at the base of the monument. He was surrounded by a handful of people who began shouting at him, calling him a racist. Police intervened. A handful of police officers stepped between those protesters and the man holding the Confederate flag. They escorted him to a police car, sat him down in the front of the police car, and drove him away. This is, as you mentioned, already happening in other cities. Last night in Durham, North Carolina, protesters surrounded the bronze statue of a Confederate soldier. They yanked it off its granite pedestal, that pedestal reading with an inscription, "To the boys who wore the gray." That statue was erected in 1924. There are literally thousands of Confederate monuments, primarily in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, as well as other states. But not just statues. We're talking bridges, buildings, schools, roads. And the crisis is going to be brewing in other cities. Certainly it will happen in Richmond, Virginia, not far from here, the former capital of the Confederacy, where there are already heated discussions about what to do with Monument Avenue, which hosts a variety of Confederate statues there. The mayor of that city wants to preserve the statues, but preserve them in context that is unpalatable, as you can understand, to a lot of people. Those who find the whole system of slavery to be so abhorrent that we should have no memories of it whatsoever, to those who believe that what their great-great-great-great-granddaddy did in the Civil War should be remembered and preserved. And then this ventures into the area of airbrushing of history, a tactic of totalitarian governments, a common practice in the former Soviet Union, where people who fell into disfavor in the government were literally airbrushed out of history. So that's some of the context of what's happening here in Charlottesville today. We've also learned just when there will be a memorial service for Heather Heyer, the young woman, the 32-year-old who was killed by the white vigilante who mowed down people in downtown Charlottesville on Saturday. It will happen tomorrow at the Paramount Theater. There's already on the marquee of the Paramount Theater this slogan: "United we stand, lives lost but not forgotten." We understand that the police are going to take great precautions to preserve security there. They told us in a statement, as the chief said yesterday, Charlottesville police are working with the family to ensure safety, but we will not go into specifics. So that's where things stand right now in Charlottesville. All calm, but tensions still exist here, as they do across many of the former Confederate states and wherever we have these kinds of Confederate monuments. John and Heather, back to you.
Still boiling there. Doug McKelway. Doug, thank you. In the meantime, President Trump calling out the mainstream media for criticizing his latest statement on the violence in Charlottesville. The president is back in New York City now. He clarified his original response at the White House yesterday.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
Afterward, Mr. Trump tweeting, made additional remarks on Charlottesville and realized once again that the fake news media will never be satisfied. Truly bad people. Let's bring in our panel. Betsy Woodruff is a politics reporter for the Daily Beast. Chris Deaton, deputy online editor for the Weekly Standard. Betsy, we heard from David Lee Miller that two CEOs who were on the president's manufacturing panel resigned even after he made those remarks on Charlottesville. So clearly it's not just the news media who are not satisfied. Some Americans aren't satisfied with the way he's handled this whole thing.
Right, exactly. And that feeds to one of President Trump's central concerns about his presidency. My understanding is that the president very much feels that even though he is the most powerful person on the planet, that he's under siege, that he's spent his entire administration under attack, whether it's from faithless government employees who didn't go as far as they could have to enforce the travel ban, whether it's from defecting senators and the Republican conference on the Hill who didn't sort of lay down their careers to try to help him pass health care, but predominantly the president feels that he's under siege because of this media criticism, because of how much heat he's taken for the way his presidency is unfolding. And that siege mentality is something that you see show up whenever the president publicly deals with a controversy. You see it show up in the way that particularly his sons, including Eric Trump recently on this network, expressed concern and a sense that the White House is under attack. That's the view that the president has, and that really colors his responses to a lot of these major crises. His tweet about how he thought the media were very poor people because they weren't satisfied with his response to Charlottesville, that tweet itself undercut his response because it implied that he only made those comments about neo-Nazis and the KKK to try to satisfy the media rather than out of good faith. So this siege mentality is something that's very real for him and something that his top advisors fear could truly make it harder for him to bring the country together.
Chris, in your view, was this response to the Charlottesville tragedy, was it an opportunity missed?
Well, it certainly was, because I think that especially in the modern media cycle where information moves so quickly, I mean, I think we have a misnomer out there sometimes where we talk about mass media. It's really mass information and all the channels from which we get information almost instantaneously, that you have a captive audience in the immediate aftermath of a massive event like this. And for the president to reserve his best statement, the one that brings the most comfort, that has the best chance of creating some sort of unifying factor in the country for a period of 48 hours, not really a good look on his part. I mean, part of, to pick up on what Betsy was talking about a little bit here, as an only child, I just got to thinking, about how it's not always about you. And when you try to turn this comment back on the media once again, and you deflect attention once again from the actual event that's going on, you're the president of the United States. You have an outsized influence for setting the agenda and bringing some sort of comfort or unifying message to the country. That is a very big charge of the presidency. Sometimes it's not always about policy, especially with this presidency right now. So indeed, it's an opportunity missed for the president for those reasons as well.
And Betsy, the approval numbers that we're seeing in the polls for the president aren't good right now.
Right. The approval numbers are extraordinarily low, even if you look at pollsters like Rasmussen that tend to find numbers in their polls that are a little bit sunnier for the president and for the White House. The reality is, if these numbers don't change, the Republican Party could be in for a real beating next year. Of course, there's plenty of time for the White House to try to find a way to turn this around. There's plenty of time to make big changes, but they already have made some substantial changes in the West Wing. Just in the last month, we've seen General Kelly come in as chief of staff, and there's been a slight rollback in some of the president's more controversial tweets. We saw him tweet and then unretweet some questionable tweets this morning, which perhaps could indicate General Kelly's influence. But on the whole, this broader question of how the White House functions, of how the president communicates to the American people, is still very much an unanswered one. And I think that's part of the reason that the president is getting such negative feedback from many American voters who are responding to these polls, because he still hasn't unified, he hasn't brought together his project, and he's very much talking about policies and cultural issues in a way that's just reactive.
And this isn't, Chris, as you've pointed out, this isn't something like health care reform or infrastructure.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is an apolitical matter. I mean, there are certain things in this country where the public is always going to have some sharp disagreements and discourse. We've already seen it this year with health care. One of the things that the president came into office on with respect to policy high at the top of his agenda list was immigration. People are going to have disagreements over those types of things. To try to bring them together under some unified front is a difficult thing to do when you have more of a 50-50 country. This is the type of thing where we're decades and decades and decades beyond this at this point. This is the type of thing where you would assume that the president of the United States would be able to leverage a moment for national unity, to bring everybody under the same umbrella. And he attempted to do that in his own way on Friday, but just missing the mark by failing to expressly call out the instigators of it.
Chris Deaton, Weekly Standard, Betsy Woodruff, Daily Beast. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Sure thing.
Well, still coming up this hour of Happening Now, Defense Secretary James Mattis warning North Korea that targeting Guam will mean war. How Kim Jong-un is reacting. Plus, could the president's chief strategist be on the way out? The new calls for Steve Bannon's ouster, and the verdict in the Taylor Swift groping trial, and the message the pop star hopes that it sends.
I think it is a new day because someone with the guts and the courage to stand up with absolutely no upside in doing so, that being Taylor Swift, has told everyone, this is it. The line's drawn.
Well, breaking right now in the North Korea showdown as the rogue nation seems to be backing down from its attack or for its threat to attack Guam. Now, Kim Jong-un delaying a decision on firing missiles towards the U.S. territory, and CIA Director Mike Pompeo making it clear that we are not on the brink of nuclear war when he defended the president's tough rhetoric.
The president's made very clear to the North Korean regime how America will respond if certain actions are taken. We are hopeful that the leader of that country will understand them in precisely the way they are intended, to permit him a place to get where we can get the nuclear weapons off the peninsula. It's that straightforward.
Well, joining us now is Jonathan Schanzer. He is the Senior Vice President at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So the turnaround by North Korea, if in fact we believe them, do you think that it's in regards to President Trump's tough rhetoric? Do you think that's what turned them around?
Well, I think the tough rhetoric is part of it, and I think it does mark a change in policy. I think in the past we've not really used that credible threat of military force, and that may have an impact on the leader of North Korea. But I think that also the fact that we have all elements of American power at play here. We've got diplomacy working, we've got that back channel underway, we've got the threat of sanctions against China, and we're looking to galvanize international support. All of those things brought together, I think, really poses a challenge to the North Korean regime. But more importantly, I think we have to remember that the North Koreans are really good at this cat and mouse game. So they can ratchet up tension and then they can bring it back down again, take us off our edge, bring down our vigilance, and then start back over again. And I think that is the pattern that we should expect here.
Yeah, that's why I said if we believe them. Let's take a listen to what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Lunsford, had to say.
Do we have the capability to defend the peninsula? Do we have the capability to defend Guam, Hawaii, and the United States? The answer is yes, we do.
Now and into the future.
Now and into the future. Again, based on the projection of capacity we have, we will make adjustments to our force posture, and we'll make our adjustments to our capabilities based on the threat as it emerges. But we're clearly watching that very closely, and our posture here in the theater, in our capability development, back at home, is based on our projections of the threat.
General Dunford making those comments in South Korea, then from there on to Beijing and then Tokyo. All three of those countries obviously don't want war as well. What do you think about his comments?
Look, I think he's saying all the right things, that we have the ability to protect our interests in the Pacific. I think the real key right now is the fact that we are reaching out to some of our allies in the Pacific as well as some of our adversaries. We have long held that China is really the key to all of this, that the Chinese are the ones who are the financial outlet for North Korea. Without China, they are completely cut off from the international system. So we need to be working with them while we continue to make it clear to the North Koreans that we have that credible threat of force in response to whatever plans they may have to provoke the United States.
Yeah, and also all at the same time, Iran watching the very latest on all these developments. We don't really have time to get to that, but that an important part of all this as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
There's new evidence to tell you about in the murder of those two young girls in Indiana. Could this be the break detectives are looking for? An update now on the still unsolved murders of two young girls in Indiana earlier this year. The lead detective investigating the killings of Abby Williams and Libby German says police have more audio connected to the case. It comes from Libby's phone, which was found at the scene. Investigators say the suspect approached the girls while they were walking on a trail in Delphi back in February, and Libby started recording his voice on her phone. Police say they also have DNA evidence from the scene, plus this artist's sketch. They've conducted hundreds of interviews, but they still want people with information on the murders to come forward.
Well, just in, Alabama voters casting ballots in today's special GOP primary election for the Senate seat vacated by Jeff Sessions. President Trump endorsing Senator Luther Strange, who was appointed by the governor to fill that seat temporarily. His opponents, Roy Moore and Congressman Mo Brooks, already out voting this morning. Moore is the former state Supreme Court Chief Justice, and Brooks currently serves as a U.S. Congressman. Jerry Willis live for us in our New York newsroom with more. Hi, Jerry.
Hi there. Well, you know, all eyes on Alabama today, as you say, in the race for Jeff Sessions' Senate seat, which he vacated when he became Attorney General. And though no Republican has lost a Senate race in Alabama since 1992, Luther Strange, the Republican incumbent, is struggling. What he has on his side, however, is a lot. President Donald Trump has supported the candidate. Trump's coattails are still so long in the Yellowhammer state that rivals are loath to criticize him for fear of alienating the president's supporters. Strange also has the support of Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, whose allies have helped put together a multi-million-dollar campaign. But the ire at McConnell and the former Governor Robert Bentley, who appointed Strange 6 months ago, runs deep. McConnell is seen as an establishment Republican incapable of putting a health care bill through the Senate, while Bentley left his office after a sex scandal. Rivals are taking advantage of these weaknesses, with Brooks urging voters to send a huge message to the U.S. Senate establishment by defeating McConnell's hand-chosen pick. Now, today, the Strange campaign said the president has recorded robocalls urging Alabama Republican voters to get to the polls and cast a ballot for Strange. The calls went out to 150,000 GOP households. Trump, however, says his administration is accomplishing many of his goals, but I need Luther to help us out, he says. Political watchers expect a September runoff for the Republicans, with polls showing more consistently leading as Strange and Brooks are battling for a runner-up position. Strange cast his ballot this morning. The polls will close tonight at 8 p.m. Back to you.
All right, Jerry Willis. Thank you, Jerry.
The president's initial reaction to the violence in Charlottesville widely criticized. Now there are new questions about how long Steve Bannon, the president's chief strategist, can stay in his job in the White House. Our political panel weighs in on that. Plus, a Hollywood stunt turns deadly after a motorcycle crash on a movie set, and one witness says the tragic accident happened in the blink of an eye.
I just started shaking. I was scared.
It was just like a thud. She just disappeared underneath.
Breaking this hour of Happening Now, the cast and crew of the movie Deadpool 2 mourning the death of a co-worker after a stunt driver crashed her motorcycle during a shoot in Vancouver. Now, witnesses say that she appeared to speed up quickly, and then she quickly lost control. Ryan Reynolds, who plays the lead in the film, in a release statement said that he is heartbroken, shocked, and devastated. John?
Well, just in, President Trump still taking heat from all sides for failing to initially condemn white hate groups by name after the deadly violence in Charlottesville, Virginia over the weekend.
Mr. President, can you explain why you did not condemn those hate groups by name over the weekend? They've been condemned. They have been condemned.
That question after the president put the blame squarely on white nationalists yesterday, and comes as we hear the president has considered getting rid of Steve Bannon. A New York Times headline today reads, "Bannon in limbo as Trump faces growing calls for the strategist's ouster." It goes on to report, quote, "What once endeared him to the president has now become a major liability after the president waited 2 days to blame white supremacists for the violence in Charlottesville. There is new pressure from Mr. Trump's critics to dismiss Mr. Bannon." Let's bring in Josh Holmes, former chief of staff to Senator Mitch McConnell, and Jim Kessler, former legislative and policy director for Senator Chuck Schumer and the senior vice president for policy and a co-founder of Third Way. Thanks for being here, gentlemen. Josh, let's start with you. What does Steve Bannon bring to the White House, first of all?
Well, I think from the beginning people thought that he was sort of the center of the president's campaign agenda. There was a very nationalist theme that took over that had a lot to do with domestic jobs, domestic economic concerns that Steve Bannon had been extraordinarily focused on. And I think that from that standpoint was a decent fit. Where this has evolved, however, as we saw last weekend, is whether or not this president has a soft spot for, quite frankly, white nationalists nationalism. I don't think that I think that's a little bit hyperbolic, and I'm not sure that Steve Bannon is responsible for that, but you saw in the New York Times today, there's a certain amount of inference there that certainly doesn't help this White House.
Yeah, Jim, you've been in high-profile political positions. If someone is proving to be a liability to the political leader in office, how does one get the message? How do you know when it's time to go?
It's time for him to go. I mean,
okay.
we had a situation. Look, the president actually had a very easy task this weekend. You had Nazis and Klanspeople marching with automatic weapons through a peaceful town and inciting violence. All he had to do was criticize them, and criticize them strongly. Steve Bannon, by all accounts, said, don't be too tough on these white nationalists. And now the president is facing, a week of turmoil. That is the last unpardonable sin for Steve Bannon. I think he will be gone by Friday. Friday is the firing day in Washington, D.C. I think he'll be out.
Josh, do you see it the same way? I mean, would you expect that this is the week that he gets his walking papers?
Well, a couple of things. First, I think it remains to be seen whether we know if Steve Bannon asked the president for his tepid response on Saturday. I don't think he can pass the buck on that. I think that's President Trump's fault first and foremost, and I don't think any advisor has the capability of making a misstep for the president that is that grave and that serious that has to be corrected within 2 days. But here's the other point. I think everybody's sort of tired of the White House having staffing decisions play out like game shows. I mean, who cares who is the senior advisor in the White House? If you have a staffing decision to make, if the person is not serving this president in the way that this president feels is acceptable, then get rid of him. Move on, find somebody else who will, and let's get the job going. There's a lot to do here.
Well, according to that Times article, Jim, Bannon said that he only expected to stay in the job 8 months to a year, and he wanted to try to get the president's agenda on track and then move on.
The president's agenda is not on track. He's had the least accomplishments of any new president that I can remember. I think part of the reason is Steve Bannon's direction. It's been very hostile towards moderates and independents and Democrats, quite frankly. His hiring was the biggest mistake that the Trump administration made in terms of personnel. But we have a new chief of staff. He's supposed to bring order. Bannon is chaos. He needs to go.
Well, on that point, though, Jim, he certainly helped the president win the White House. I mean, the president's campaign was kind of floundering when Bannon came on board.
Winning the White House and governing are two entirely different things. And look, Bannon was a signal when he was hired in November that said this administration is going to move in a radically right-wing direction. It has, and as a result, it hasn't been able to get anything done. If the president decided to start with, infrastructure package and tax reform, we'd be doing something having a very different conversation right now.
But there have been reports before of the demise of Mr. Bannon within this White House, and Josh, so far, he has hung in there.
Yeah, he has hung in there. And, I think the president sees a lot of the past success that he had in the campaign and thinks he owes him a debt of gratitude for it. But, to Jim's point, look, there's a lot to do here, and it's time to move on. If Steve Bannon is no longer serving this president in a way that this president feels is moving the ball forward, you got to find somebody else who will. We don't need to read about this on the front page of the New York Times. We don't need endless cable segments about Steve Bannon. Is he up? Is he down? I think everybody's collectively tired of the staff turnover, and I think actually General Kelly, coming in as the chief of staff, has done a whale of a job at putting all this stuff to rest. Staff can't have staff. Staff serves the president. Period.
Yeah, and that does seem to be one of the turning points here, Jim. General Kelly coming on board as chief of staff. There seems to be a new discipline, maybe a new direction in the White House, and that is where Stephen Bannon could find himself on the short end.
Yeah, I felt that the timing on this for Bannon was especially bad because you've got Kelly, he's taking over, he wants to tighten the reins, and then by all accounts, Bannon went around Kelly, advised Trump, look, Bannon's only an advisor to Trump. Trump was the one who made the decisions about what he had to say, and it was a bad decision about Charlottesville over the weekend. But this is a huge distraction for the White House. I'm sure Kelly is making the case that he needs to go.
We'll see what happens on Friday, Jim. If your prediction proves true, I'll ask you for some lottery numbers. Jim Kessler, Josh Holmes, thank you both.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Well, the verdict is in as the jury finds in favor of Taylor Swift at her groping trial. So why did they only award her $1? And what is the pop star's reaction? Plus, an airport fills with foam, trapping 4 people inside. So what caused it? Welcome back. A bizarre scene at an airport in Maine as foam filled an entire hangar. It was some 25 feet high in some spots after a malfunction in the airport's fiery suppression system, we're told. 4 people were actually briefly trapped inside, but emergency responders did manage to get them out.
The foam isn't considered to be toxic. It is a bit of an irritant. So basically what we did with the folks is we cleaned them off, washed them down, offered them showers. That's the initial mitigation step.
A shower, you think? Well, the airport's runway stayed open throughout the entire incident. The operations were not impacted. John?
Crazy stuff. New information now on the verdict in the Taylor Swift groping trial. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before finding in favor of the pop star and awarding her exactly what she asked for, $1. Alicia Acuna, live in Denver with more. Alicia?
Hi, John. Yes, and that $1 was a symbolic amount for damages. Swift's attorney saying that it held immeasurable value, saying it meant, quote, no means no. Here he is after the verdict.
Boys need to know, girls need to know, women, men, everyone. It's a matter of respect and decency. And until somebody draws that line and resets the dice, we don't all know. And she did that. She did that. Taylor Swift did that. None of us did that.
This photo was a key piece of evidence. It was taken in 2013 prior to Swift's concert in Denver when she says David Mueller, then a radio host in town, reached under her skirt and grabbed her behind. He was fired 2 days later, and 2 years later he sued Swift. She countersued, accusing him of sexual assault and battery. After court, Swift said in a statement, quote, my hope is to help those whose voices should also be heard. Therefore, I will be making donations in the near future to multiple organizations that help sexual assault victims defend themselves. Mueller insists he did not grope the singer, explaining when he moved in for the photo, he bumped her rib and arm but did not reach under her dress. Swift's attorney told the jury Mueller had a fragile ego and as a radio host was insulted he was not allowed in the VIP line. Swift, who was in court every day for the 1-week trial, testified Mueller grabbed her behind and held on even as she tried to move away. On the stand, she spoke bluntly in her description of those moments, and John, she and her mother, Andrea, who was also named in the suit, embraced each other while the verdict was being read. Her mom was in tears. John?
Good for her. All right. Alicia Acuna.
Yes.
Thank you.
Coming up, Hurricane Gert, we've been talking about, is now churning in the Atlantic. Where Gert is heading and who it might impact coming up. Plus, this is amazing. A woman missing for almost 4 weeks finally found alive. Why authorities say that it is a miracle that she survived.
Doing this now going on almost 15 years, and I mean, I've never seen anything like it.
Right now, some new information on crime stories we're watching. A domestic terror plot stopped in its tracks as the feds charge a 23-year-old man they say planned and tried to execute the bombing of an Oklahoma City bank. The FBI has been monitoring him since December. In California, Scott Peterson is speaking out publicly for the first time in more than a decade as he sits on death row for the murder of his wife, Lacey. He says he was surprised by his guilty verdict and insists he was not the last person to see his pregnant wife on the day she disappeared back in 2007. The judge warning a teenager charged with murdering an Uber driver in Illinois, telling 16-year-old Eliza Wozni to behave herself behind bars after prosecutors say she attacked guards. Wozni is charged as an adult with first-degree murder in a knife and machete attack on an Uber driver who later died from his injuries.
Well, right now, an Alabama woman has been found alive after she was missing for almost a month. Authorities say that she managed to survive by eating berries and drinking from puddles, but police are still working to uncover all of the details.
A whole lot more to this story. It's going to be sad and heartwarming at the same time. I mean, when the story is actually released.
Well, 25-year-old Lisa Theris lost 50 pounds while she was lost in the wilderness. Investigators say that she was with these two men when they robbed a hunting lodge, but claims that she had no idea that it was going to happen. Both of those men now face burglary charges. So a lot to be uncovered there.
An extreme weather alert for you now. Meet Hurricane Gert, the second hurricane of this 2017 season. Gert expected to strengthen in the coming hours and could create massive waves all along the East Coast.
Senior meteorologist Janice Dean is live in the Fox Weather Center with the very latest. I know, Janice, we were trying to decide this morning if Gert was female or male.
Well, if Gert was a person, it would be a female.
Like Gertrude, yes.
Because Harvey is the next letter, or the next name on the list. But you know what? Hurricanes are not male or female. They just get named, either a female or a male name. And this one's named Gert. And the good news about Gert is that it's going to remain offshore. But as John and Heather mentioned, the high waves and the rip currents are going to be the big threat from this. So our second named hurricane in this 2017 season. And you can see the forecast wave heights, especially across the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast tomorrow. So if you're a good surfer, you're going to maybe want to take the day off today or tomorrow to do some good surfing. But the rip currents are going to be dangerous. So if you're not a seasoned surfer, just be really careful and stay out of the water. All right. Rip current threat is going to be high again, especially across the Northeast as we head into tomorrow. All right. I think my husband's going to take the day off and do some surfing. Okay. Now it is a busy season, or the Hurricane Center is saying we need to be on guard, especially if you live across the Atlantic coast, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean, because we've got a couple of features we're watching. This area of low pressure that's going to cross across the Caribbean over the next couple of days. And then we're watching another area of low pressure that is rolling off the coast of Africa. We're getting into the peak season, the Cape Verde season. That's when we see the most destructive and very strong hurricanes coming off the coast of Africa. So our first area of low pressure that has a 60% chance of developing over the next 5 days. This one, it looks like it's going to move into the Caribbean and then continue along its westward track. Some of the computer models actually make a curve here and sort of follow the path of Gert and won't affect the U.S. coastline, which is great news. But the one behind that, we're going to have to pay attention. Tropical activity, we're getting into that peak season right now. Here we are right now. And then as we get into around September 10th, that's when we start to really see these storms crank up in the Atlantic. And so far, we've been busy, right? We've got Gert out there, the G named storms. We have 7 named storms, 2 hurricanes already, and the statistics are upwards. The National Hurricane Center is saying right now we're expecting a very busy season, perhaps 2 to 5 major hurricanes. And John and Heather, we haven't had a major hurricane hit the U.S. in over a decade, so I'm concerned with folks being complacent. If you live anywhere along the East Coast, along the Gulf of Mexico, you need to know what your preparations are now, because these things can pop up, and we will be, of course, bringing you the very latest. But for now, Gert is just going to be a fish storm.
All right. So fish beware if you're listening to Janice Dean right now. All right, Janice, thank you.
Of course.
A Fox News alert and another bit of a black eye for President Trump, because the president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing has now dropped off of that council just 16 minutes after the president issued what some are calling his grandstanding tweet. He is the 4th member of that council to step down. President Trump tweeted this just a few minutes prior to the announcement, quote, "For every CEO that drops out of the Manufacturing Council," the president said, "I have many to take their place. Grandstanders should not have gone on. Jobs!" Exclamation point. The president trying to point to jobs and the economy as his #1 issue. But again, 4 members of his Alliance for American Manufacturing Council have left in the last few days.
It'll be interesting if he references that at all, if he speaks on it when he is supposed to make some comments today on infrastructure, after 3 p.m. Eastern?
Infrastructure is the topic of the day. I would expect he would not allude to that, but we'll see.
We'll see. He's alluding to it on Twitter. So, well, coming up next in the hour of Happening Now, new for you, legal action involving sanctuary cities. The lawsuit just filed against the Justice Department. And will it hold up? We'll talk about that. Plus, new word that the Obama administration was warned years ago about Russia's plan to disrupt our election process. Were those warnings, where did they come from, and what they did or did not do about them?